Thank you all so much for coming. I'm going to talk a little bit about Tanika's work and frame it for the Salon, which is really an experiment in collaborating across disciplinary as well as areal boundaries to stage a conversation around the question of religion, rights, and secularity. But I want to begin first by thanking BCRW, Catherine Samé, and Janet Jacobson, who couldn't be here with us. Right? Yes, Janet Jackson surely couldn't be with us. But to thank Catherine and Janet, our Janet, for their support and enthusiasm in hosting the Salon. I'll just very briefly tell you about the cast of characters. So starting with my left, this is Tanika Sarkar, who's a professor of history at Jawaharlal Nehru University. Winnifred Sullivan is a professor and the chair of the Religious Studies Department at Indiana University in Bloomington, and also has a position and teaches in the law school there. Neferti Tadiar, most of you here know. She is professor and director of the Women, Gender and Sexuality Studies program here. And Professor Abosede George is my colleague and co-conspirator in the history department, works on northern Nigeria. So let me begin with a few words about the structure of the Salon, which is, as I said, an experiment in bringing together diverse voices, asking in a sense about how what we read triggers family resemblances across the spaces in which each of us does our own work, and also how we might come together around a shared conversation that has to do with the important question of how we think about the relationship between religion, secularity, and gendered rights, and indeed, I think more broadly, empire today. So I want to begin by briefly situating Professor Sarkar's work in the context of her contributions to South Asian history and to the study of non-Western gender more broadly, and to chart out some possible trajectories for engaging the issue of religion, rights, and secularity in connected and comparative perspective. After this, Professor Sarkar will speak about her current project to give you a sense of how her long-standing concerns with gender, religiosity, female subjectivity, and indeed with Hindu majoritarianism have increasingly have sort of shaped ongoing concerns in the archive for her, and also the ways in which some of her work is shifting onto the terrain of labor subjectivity, and gendered life. After this, Winnifred Sullivan, Abosede George, and Neferti Tadiar will each speak for about 10 to 12 minutes. They'll address Tanika's arguments about the paradox of women's rights as these have developed through complex transactions between religion and the state. Their mutual entailments and fraught legacies of these terms itself derives from the fact that each has a history, and that this history is hard to disentangle from its present politicized existence. So each of our discussants will take on some of the questions that animate Tanika's work and ask how they might be stretched, transformed, or challenged in the contexts in which they work: the United States, Nigeria, and the Philippines, and East and Southeast Asia, respectively. I'll then try to pull together some strands for more intensive engagement and for discussion with all of you. We invite and indeed encourage your participation. Many of you are students in my class or in Professor Tadiar's class. And our aim in creating the seminar series, as Catherine said, on gender and empire was to think intensively and extensively about the thought space of the classroom. So let me begin actually by discussing the spaces and politics of feminist knowledge production and how it's shaped Tanika's work. Serious feminist scholarship emerged in the 1980s and 1990s out of the colleges of Delhi University. Places like the Lady Shriram College, Miranda House, and Indraprasth College, all women's colleges, as well as St. Stephen's College, where Professor Sarkar taught for many years before she came to JNU. Indeed, some of the most important texts of post-colonial feminist theory and non-Western gender history were produced in these spaces. I'm thinking about Sudesh Vaid and Kumkum Sangari's edited volume called Recasting Women, that many of you here probably know, or another edited volume called Lie of the Land, which is co-edited by Rajeshwari Sundarajan, which opened up the politics of English studies in post-colonial contexts. What I want to note here is that feminist knowledge production occurred under conditions of intensive teaching in Delhi colleges, but as well grew out of deep activism and the intellectual collaboration that was produced by feminist scholars such as Tanika and many others. We need to bear this in mind when we think about the institutional connections and the constraints, as well as the intellectual genealogies that animate the politics behind the profound rethinking of South Asian history and historiography that was undertaken by those who forefronted gender and sexuality in and through their work. These efforts at the time were often conducted through implicit and explicit critique of the masculinist paradigms and the social exclusions of the scholars associated with the Subaltern Studies Collective that, again, many of you perhaps know about. And the question here that gender historians posed was the question of whether gender was here and the subaltern was there, or whether we could actually think about a more profound way of engaging the question of gendered subjectivity and indeed of sex subjectivity. And while subaltern scholars privileged culture and religiosity as resources for subaltern protest, it's the careful engagements with religion and liberal imperialism that's marked Tanika Sarkar's work. Here we see a persistent concern with the double life of religion, if you will. While feminist critiques of cultural nationalism expressed an acute discomfort with key domains of everyday life, including religious practice, Tanika's work has tried to walk that difficult edge between secular critique and engaging religious life worlds. In this, I think her work reflects the perhaps impossible, yet necessary effort to connect social history with social thought, and I'll return to this in a second. But I want to just briefly take up this question of the doubled attention to religion in her work. On the one hand, we have religion as the product of governmental intervention and legal regulation. Or this is a consideration of the category of religion as the result of an official separation of the theological from the political, and their continued, if under-acknowledged, interanimation. In Talal Asad's terms, this is the emergence of religion as the domain of a discrete body of knowledge about the sacred in the course of a process of secularization. Or we might say that religion is the secular or secularized other to secular modernity. So religion then increasingly in this paradigm becomes an individual right to be protected by the state. It's both deeply private and perhaps necessarily illegible to the state as belief, except when it appears reasonable. This arc of Tanika's work on the resurgence of political Hinduism or Hindu nationalism in the 1980s and its earlier links with the Hindu colonial modernity was deeply concerned with the public and political life of Hindu religion. For instance, in edited works such as Women and the Hindu Right and Khaki Shorts and Saffron Flags, her effort was to think about the intersections of demographic majoritarianism and religious assertion and intolerance in the context of political engagement and intervention. The politics of history and the deep time of the archaeological past became key sites of intervention in the face of Hindu nationalists' project to rewrite South Asia's geohistory. A similar set of concerns, albeit I think with a very different historical basis, has also activated many of the concerns of Winnifred Sullivan to understand the force and the resurgence of a legal Christianity in these imperial times. The other arc of Tanika's work engages questions of sacrality and numinosity, that is the deep temporality of religious life, its predication on notions of sacrifice and non-instrumentality, the sociality of belief and obligation, and those spaces of ecstatic life which cannot be folded into liberal norms. The most illuminating account of this is Tanika's exploration of how the life worlds of Vaishnava devotion and imagined intimacy with the gods produced a desire for reading for Rashundari Devi, a woman who wrote the first autobiography in Bengali in 1868. In Words to Win, Sarkar shows how the transgressive desire to read was predicated on a desire to read a particular sacred text. I want to suggest here that exploring the space of religious desire opens up the complex question in Sarkar's work of a collapse between religious embodiment on the one hand and the embodiments of gender on the other. The issue here is not the standard association of women with community and its inner identity as an element of social control. Rather, here there is a more nuanced concern with how ecstatic engagement with the divine is itself a space for the cultivation of sexed subjectivity. It's in this tracing of a complex collapse between sex, gender, and religion, while also seeking to historicize their disarticulation through the regime of liberal rights, that Sarkar comes to ask about the specific genealogy of rights when it attaches to the emancipation of gender. Unlike studies more recently that have located gendered religiosity outside liberal life, Sarkar wants to argue that rights are both a hazard and a necessity for the modern life of gendered subjects. So she tracks what she calls something like rights, the desire for a name and the forms of individual selfhood that goes with this name, rights, as an opening, but one that's foreclosed precisely by the violent embodiments of gender and its continued associations with gender, with culture or religiosity. So this, she wants to suggest that rights are both an opening and an immediate closure, both simultaneously. This, I think, poses more profound questions of how embodied subjects access the universal, and whether differently embodied subjects have diverse histories, as is certainly the case with caste subjects, subjects of race, and so on and so forth. And I think what this opens up also more broadly is not so much the effort to challenge the divide between religious life and liberal norms, but indeed sort of a broader and I think a deeper question of whether we need to revisit the inner legacies of liberalism itself and to think about it in more complicated ways. So I want to just kind of open up, and I wanted to really get at these three terms of religion, rights, and secularity, and to think about how questions of gendered embodiment might be really troubling many of these questions in Tanika's work, and one of the arcs for our conversation to follow. So thank you, and please welcome Tanika.
Thank you for that very generous and indeed most over-generous introduction, and I thank the Salon for organizing this event and look forward to the fellow panelists and your questions and comments. And I'm delighted that I have a couple of old students here, and that gives me some courage to get on with what I have to say. But I won't take much of your time. I think this conversation was planned around a paper of mine that's going to be published, with a lot of help from Anupama. And that was about widow immolations in colonial Bengal and the life that immolations had, the legal life that immolations enjoyed under colonial rule before it was abolished by a new colonial law. So for 60 years, about 1/4 of the lifespan of colonial governance in India, Sati was perfectly legal. And I want to explore this I wanted to explore this particular period as an autonomous whole with an internal unity, and to see why this was allowed and how this was governed and administered. So what I will do, I think Anupama has brought out the broadest possible implications that my work, that this present article and the rest of my work could possibly have possessed. And she has put it in ways I wish I could express myself, and I really do. And I'm especially glad because she invoked the experience of college teaching in Delhi University, which was such a great experience and which is now on the wane and under a great threat. So I really need a few minutes to explain where that article on Sati and its legal life under colonial rule and under imperial liberalism comes from. It's not a standalone piece, but it's part of a book project that I have in mind. And the book is about an encounter between Hindu faith and colonial law in the 19th century. Specifically, I explore a new colonial legal construct, that of personal laws, as distinct but not entirely insulated from the other two realms of law, civil and criminal. Here, scriptural and customary laws of Hindus and Muslims on all matters of faith, marriage, belief, caste, inheritance, etc., were meant to govern practices of each community. The domain, therefore, emerged as the sole residue of Indian sovereignty, even in colonial times, and therefore it threw up multiple social imaginaries for self-fashioning. It was perhaps the only domain under colonialism that allowed for self-fashioning on Indian terms. More specifically, I take up 3 19th century laws in the book that aroused intense controversies among Hindus. A law abolishing immolations, Sati, a law legalizing widow remarriage, and a law raising the age of consent. And the 3 laws spanned the entire 19th century. Each provoked fierce contentions. And these debates provide a concrete entry point into actual practices and knowledge forms of modern Hinduism, as well as into modalities of colonial governance, both of which shifted significantly across the long century, sometimes through the making of the very laws that I am going to discuss in the book. Historiographically, and this is the point I really want to make, my work differs from much of post-colonial histories of cultural processes under colonialism. I have 3 major points of difference, though their post-colonial insights into the cultural technologies of colonialism are of course rich and productive, and all of us have learned all that we know about these matters from them. First, I unpack and disaggregate the monolithic and fixed entity most post-colonial scholars tend to work with, which is an undifferentiated and timeless concept of Western knowledge that they translate immediately into colonial power. Ranajit Guha locates this knowledge specifically in a Western recreation of Indian past, and claims that every aspect of colonial power and statecraft was organized around that single axis. I find that problematic, as it reaffirms the very appropriation and dissolution of concrete pasts into a world history that he aims to critique himself. I see, moreover, multiple divergences, internal gaps, fractures, and incompatibilities within Western knowledge, which in any case did not direct the entire course of colonial governance. There's a major gap between the Western and the colonial, neither of which is monolithic. Secondly, I treat the history of colonial power as far more contingent, pragmatic, and opportunist, context-specific and context-divided than it is commonly believed to be. In the same measure, Indian activism, even under colonialism, was non-modular, creative, and autonomous, even when interacting with colonial constructs and laws. The book, therefore, does not belong solely to gender history. Colonial governance would be one of the major registers, and immolations will be framed within contiguous administrative changes. And this kind of a placement beyond gender throws up interesting overlaps and breaks among different administrative domains and reconfigures colonial designs for governance. Just as an instance, let us take up revenue administration, early colonial revenue administration, for instance, along with personal laws, and run them together. The late 18th century permanent settlement in Bengal endowed landlords with complete control over peasant rent. Together with immolation management, a significant part of governance is thereby delegated to traditional Indian social guardians. And several kinds of social relationships are thereby exempted from state management and direct intervention. In the mid-19th century, in contrast, a more direct and dense relationship with Indian subjects seems to appear simultaneously in both spheres, when positive intervention in personal laws is matched by a closer fiscal interactions with peasant subjects of the state. Nonetheless, in neither case, a full-scale utilitarian modernization of culture or of law ever materialized. And here, Karthik Kalyan Raman's study of the profoundly compromised nature of utilitarian projects of modern law, when applied to Indian criminal jurisprudence, is very useful. The other register for reflection is modern Hinduism, and a lot of what Anupama said flows from that. Modern Hinduism, as created very largely by 19th century Hindus themselves, though in a historical environment that was definitely shaped significantly by colonial governance. Given the state need to define scriptural and customary guidelines for ritual performance and injunctions, 19th century lay scholars and Hindu religious specialists developed new exegetical methods for textual analysis, as happened with Muslims as well. This involved selections from and readings of holy texts and reinterpretations of sacred custom, all of which were highly contested, and lines ran freely among European lay scholars and Hindu religious specialists, agreeing and disagreeing and working collaboratively on this. Colonial officials joined in the fray, often viewing the norms through the grid of English legal training and seeking analogies and parallels. I have looked at a couple of such instances, and Anupama Rao has also probed this in relation to temples and caste. But officials could by no means reinvent, completely standardize, or freeze Indian sacred or customary norms within a single code, even if they wanted to. So the course of lawmaking reveals far more of indeterminacy and internal contestation, as well as an active and decisive Indian agency, rather than the passive reception of a singular intellectual influence coming from Western imperialism and liberal imperialism. I also find strong continuities from early modern times in a long-term rethinking of caste, gender, and faith. A history of an expansive 19th century public sphere, both vernacular and English, is required, moreover, to act as the mediating and connecting hinge among these several processes, as well as the expressive medium to articulate and create social change. My third and final difference with post-colonial historiography, and I'll stop with that, is about its readings of modern gender in terms of an epistemic violence and cultural imperialism alone, which almost entirely occludes the power of Indian cultural norms. And this has happened most strikingly with histories of immolation, where the scandal is identified more with abolition of immolations than with the ritual burnings themselves. There is quite an astonishing sensitivity in post-colonial studies to endangered cultural particularities. And there's also an equally astonishing insensitivity. Did I say insensitivity or sensitivity the first time? Sensitive. And also an equally astonishing insensitivity to both the act of burning and the social compulsions of an extreme patriarchal kind that the ritual enjoined on Hindu gender. And I think in recent times, Rajeshwari Sundararajan happens to be the only feminist scholar who restores the viscerality and materiality of pain to immolations. In fact, she's the only one who refers to pain at all when talking about immolations. We are all haunted by the specter of Orientalism, and it is indeed a real danger. It's not easy to be a cultural critic of non-Western values without echoing an Orientalist tonality. But I think we are in the greater danger of forgetting how to speak as feminists for fear of speaking like Orientalists. I think in this regard, the scholarship of Dalit studies did a seminal service by forcing us to address questions of power lines within Hindu society, even in colonial times. And in my work, I follow their lead. And that's all I'll say at the present. I hope there will be many questions. Thank you so much.
So thank you to Janet and to Anu for inviting me to this salon. I feel a bit out of place. I don't study India. I think many of you do know a lot about India.
That's the point.
Thank you, Tanika, for a rich and suggestive paper, and my remarks will be in response to her, the paper she described, her chapter of her book on the regulation of Sati, particularly that interesting period when it was in the 50, 60 years that it was regulated before abolition. And what really interests me about this paper and what I enjoyed so much as someone who is both a lawyer and a scholar of religion is the complex and intertwined story of law and religion that she tells here. So as I understand it, your argument is that the British regulation of Sati in the late 18th century, in collaboration with Hindu reformers, was a catalyst for an emerging sense of self that later would bear fruit in a rights-bearing Indian woman. And maybe I say that a little more strongly than you would. I don't mean to suggest causation exactly there, but that this is a moment when, interestingly, the legal regulation of Sati focused on the Sati herself in a way that is interestingly suggestive of a modern kind of sense of self. Not that Sati was not always understood to be necessarily voluntary, but that the process itself of consulting with pandits and codifying what constituted consent, including analogizing legal consent to common law notions of consent in contract law, gave the Sati a personality that she maybe previously had lacked, or a different personality probably. So as you say, this story is almost a textbook illustration of Henry Maine's famous evolutionary description of law as moving progressively from status to contract. I was also interested in the way in which, and this is sort of another aspect of this very rich chapter, of the way in which the effect of regulation itself, not simply on consent and the way consent is important in forming this notion of the Indian woman, but the way in which modern regulatory law changes religion. It seemed analogous in some ways to Franklin Pressler's work on the South Indian temple, where he shows quite remarkably, and I think this is one of the few places, few historians and legal historians in the world who have done this, shown how the regulation of South Indian temples, both under the British and later under independent India, gradually changes the nature of the religious practice and in these temples where competency in Sanskrit, tidiness, financial regularity, the bureaucratic regulation of these temples gradually sort of, if you want, forms a modern religion. And you see how the encounter with modern law changes religion and shifts the relationship of religion and politics in these temples. So that although Indian politicians for sure still come to the temples, the relationship that the kings had with these temples is completely changed, and the relationship has become bureaucratized, if you like, as that's what Pressler says. So this encounter between law and religion has a very interesting, what you well describe as a doubling effect. So modern law, British regulatory law, and scriptural law, also a modern law, in a sense, modern Hindu law, or an evolving modern Hindu law, conspire together to define what consent means and to routinize Sati. And religious law comes into its own, perhaps, in a new way when it is recognized by the state. Because when the modern state comes to regulate religion, ironically, and this is true in the US as well, it is religious law, it's religion as law or religious law that it most easily recognizes as religion. So religion becomes, ironically, more legal under the regulation of the modern state. And one can see that that effect in other contexts as well. Just for example, the ways in which in prison settings today, the administration of religious freedom creates the Muslim who must pray 5 times a day. That is who the Muslim is, and it flattens out and reifies in a very similar way. Chaim Soloveitchik writes of the modernization of Jewish orthodoxy in a similar way, in the same kind of routinization. Being a Jew is no longer what your grandmother taught you, but now how ritual is measured and regulated by texts. And interestingly, this regulatory process that Tanika describes in India also occurred occurred partly out of deference to a notion of the demands of religious toleration and religious freedom, which is also connected to other interests that I have, and the way in which what regimes and advocacy around religious freedom can produce, and this is a particularly stark example. So, as I understand it, bureaucratization also led to the notion that Sati was not the rare act of a virtuoso religious exemplar, but was available to the ordinary woman as a display of piety and power. We see a transformation of the Sati from the occasional woman to every woman, and finally, possibly with fuller emancipation, to no woman. I mean, is that, it's this middle place which interests me, and perhaps it's this middle place which I think we all live in all the time, which might be termed the effect of a kind of modern democratization of religion that occurs under modern law, not unlike that which Saba Mahmoud describes in Egypt, but which is also evident in many other contexts. So I understand you to see the key moment as the introduction of a more robust notion of consent. It's that, it's that attention to consent that is brought about through the British regulation of Sati, which is a key moment in the shift of the Indian woman with no independent existence to one who emerges with her own, through this focus by both Hindu reformers and colonialists on the actual details of her consent. When it occurs, at what age it can occur, whether it can be retracted. This is all familiar to any of you who've been to law school. This is the heart of what modern contract is about. How does one actually pinpoint legally when the meeting of minds occurs or when the consent occurs? This is something that's impossible for law to do, so it's just constantly looking for externalities to identify consent. And you see how that process of legally identifying consent changes the notion of what the woman's role is in this right. But it is not just law. I wonder whether it might be accurate to see the Sati as claiming religious power at the same time. And it's not simply a flexing of her capacity to contract in Henry Main's sense that gives her individuality and power. It is also her capacity to save her family and her nation. If immolation, as you suggest, gave gender oppression positive meaning, did it not also come to give every woman a more robust religious role in her community in a time of increasing resistance to British power? And could that religious power itself not also be an emergent form of rights claiming? All of that's a little beyond my knowledge, but just an effort. But let me turn for a moment to another burned woman, and one who I know more about, and one I've given some thought to, and that's Joan of Arc, who may seem an odd character, but I think there's some very interesting parallels. For certain, that was another time and place, early modern France, in the middle of a civil war, and there are other differences. Joan died arguably because she refused to consent, although I think we might revisit that. And she had a brief period of self-assertion in her lifetime when she lived a life she might have chose. But there are remarkable parallels as well, and I hope you will forgive me if I make this comparison as a way to triangulate a bit on what I think Tanika said. So Joan, like some of the Satis that Tanika describes, those who seem to have insisted on performing this rite, and increasingly so under British regulation, present themselves to us both as decision makers and as victims, as religious and political actors, and yet caught in religious and political webs, as claimants to a heavenly crown while dying excruciating deaths for causes which may seem opaque to us. Joan also negotiated a very limited range of options and arguably gained transcendence through immolation. And we know about her because of the focusing power of law and its recording propensities. She maneuvered in a space controlled by a massing of her religious and political enemies, one in which law both robbed her of her identity and yet gave it space for performance. Like the Sati, it is law that gives her her voice. One can only see Joan, as one can only see the Sati, by refusing the modern binaries of religion, law, individual, community, love, piety, human, divine. They are not simply beings in waiting. Joan is not simply the victim of a kangaroo trial staged by a misogynist church and a thuggish state conspiring to put Henry on the throne. After months of trial before up to 40 or more judges who sought unsuccessfully to box her in with their scholastic questioning and gain her assent to their assertion that the authenticity of her voices was their decision, not hers, Joan finally collapses, consents to their demands, and signs a confession. Perhaps she was also threatened with torture. She was declared a heretic and sentenced to life imprisonment. The words were, she was sentenced to eat the bread of sorrow and drink the water of contrition for the rest of her life. But it's what happens next that is most remarkable and suggestive. So the following morning after this sentence, she recanted and was immediately excommunicated, thrown out of the church, and transferred to the secular jurisdiction, to the English, and burned at the stake. In an entry dated that same month, the Bourgeois of Paris, an anonymous author of the Parisian Journal, described her death. And I hope you don't mind if I read this brief passage, partly out of deference to what you just said, because it is important not to just pass over the burning. She was, and so this is a description from a journal at the time. She was at once unanimously condemned to death and was tied to a stake on the platform, which was built of plaster, and the fire lit under her. She was soon dead, and all her clothes were burned. Then the fire was raked back, and her naked body shown to all the people, and all the secrets that could or should belong to a woman, to take away any doubts from people's minds. When they had stared long enough at her dead body, bound to the stake, the executioner got a big fire going again, round her poor carcass, which was soon burned up, both flesh and bone reduced to ashes. It's difficult to speak of this obscenity. First, her clothes were burned off. She was stripped of her authority and of her membership in the body politic. Then her body natural was destroyed. We don't know exactly why she recanted. She said she could not betray her voices. She put her men's clothes back on, and that is what condemned her. One could, without too much exaggeration, I think, argue that her recantation was an act of consent to her burning. And burning did indeed bring her transcendence of a sort, eventually. Perhaps the parallels seem a stretch to you, but it is not just her end that is interesting. What was she up to at the beginning of her public life? And here I take another cue from Tanika, who refers in her chapter to Kantorowicz and his book, The King's Two Bodies. She describes the Sati as having two bodies like the medieval kings of whom Kantorowicz writes. Her own body and the transcendent one that carries her religious and political potency. So Kantorowicz explains how the medieval kings of Europe were understood to inhabit at once a natural mortal body that lived and died and sinned like anyone else, and a second body, the immortal body symbolized by the crown. This doubling enabled both political succession and legal continuity. It was a powerful legal fiction built on a powerful religious image, that of Jesus as being both human and divine. In thinking about who Joan was and what she was up to, I have been helped by this notion of multiple bodies, and I also think it is available to more than kings, and I think that's something that Tanika points out. When Joan decided, because it's available, it's for kings, this, what the king's two bodies, the doctrine of the king's two bodies does is it enables succession of the realm, and it enables the king to both die and continue, and the crown to continue, but also importantly, it enables all sorts of legal events to have continuity past the mortal king's dying. So when Joan decided to intervene in the stalemate between the Armagnacs and the Anglo-Burgundian alliance, we might understand her to be temporarily inhabiting the body of France. With the effective vacancy on the French throne in the last throes of the 100 Years' War, the crown was available. And we might imagine Joan as having stepped in to take on the sacred burden of the French nation, as if she could choose then to use this transcendent body as available even to ordinary people, people who weren't kings. Perhaps she hoped it was temporary, that after Charles was crowned at Rheims and the English were driven out of France, she could return to civilian life. But that option was not available. The logics of political theology were inexorable. Like the king, she had to die in order to live. Those who have fallen in love with Joan offer numerous explanations for her power. She was a virgin martyr, a camp follower, that's Voltaire, a populist street fighter, that's Shakespeare, a cross-dresser, a schizophrenic, a proto-nationalist, a gender-bending, transgressive Lisbeth Salander, et cetera, et cetera. Who is this woman? Who is the Sati? I think that what Kantorowicz teaches us is that one cannot separate the religious and the political, even in a democratic context.
So I wanted to also thank Anu and Janet and Catherine for inviting me to take part in the salon and to respond to Tanika's really provocative paper and some of the stuff you said today. In the paper that we read, which you didn't, but you've heard a bit about, I found a figure that is really familiar to me from my own work. My work is on girl-saving projects in colonial Lagos, Nigeria. And this figure, of course, is the figure of the girl, or more broadly, the child, right? Mm-hmm. And she shows up in this work on, the regulation of Sati as a problem. One of the places she shows up as a problem is in the whole discussion of the crisis of consent, right? There's a problem there because although the scriptures prohibit the immolation of child widows, they do not specify who could be considered a child, right? So they leave open, right, the age range of widows who could be ritually and legally subjected to immolation. Officials tried various ways of defining the limit of childhood. You can imagine by age, by puberty, whether they've menstruated and so on, according to whether a girl had given her verbal consent. And all of these were, of course, secondary to the aims of families and their communities who had their own interests in either going forward with a case of immolation or in prohibiting an immolation from taking place, which sometimes happened. But the looseness of the scriptures, and by extension the law, permitted a number of cases of child widow immolations. And what's interesting is that it seemed to be precisely the cases of very young widows that caused colonial officials the greatest unease. And it was precisely these cases that were placed at the center of the regulatory restrictions that later evolved. So the girl widow then does some work for Hindu lawyers arguing against the practice of immolation, and they also do some work for colonial officials who are scrounging around for scripturally grounded means of combating or arguing against the practice. This calls to my mind the question that I deal with in some of my work, which is the question of under what circumstances the native appears as a child, or as a girl, to be specific in this case. If customarily, not in the sense of actual custom, but in the sense of colonial custom, the native girl is either legible as a daughter, right, and thus kind of ensconced in her natal family, or legible as a wife, and thus ensconced in a kind of a conjugal family. How does she become available to be governed as something else? How does she come to bear an entitlement to something that is like a right, something like a right to life below a certain age, that can supersede the entitlements of the conjugal family or the natal family to govern their members, right, in customarily or scripturally determined ways? This question of the child and when and how the native child, right, becomes a child without qualifier is one that I'm concerned with in my own work on these girl-saving projects in colonial Lagos. So there, the discourse of vulnerability and the ascription of vulnerability becomes a way of according gender, of individuation, of kind of disaggregating communities such that the child becomes directly governable. And the discourse of vulnerability also becomes a means of mobilizing cross-class, cross-racial, and international kind of salvation projects. I look at the 20th century, and it may, since your work is much earlier, it may still be appropriate because in many ways India becomes kind of a laboratory for colonial governance in the later empire in Africa. In the 1930s, this period that I think about as the age of imperial liberalism in Africa, colonial governments began to interest themselves in the lived experiences of formerly marginal subjects. So subjects like, where am I? I'm trying to skip a little bit. Subjects like women, convicts, the poor, children, etc., who had formerly and formally been invisible to the state. In this period, new imperial actors and new discourses kind of emerged to heighten state interest in these populations, to render them their problems more clearly and to render them more clearly as problems. One of the things that I try to think about is the difference between kind of liberal governance in the metropole and its translation into African colonies. In the metropole, you know, liberalism introduces a kind of a new forms of engagement between governments and their subjects, such that the ruled are now enjoined to see themselves as participants in their own government. And liberal government in the metropole kind of situates the state as a zone of expert knowledge on the means of producing the well-being of subjects, right? And through this, it also fosters kind of the subject's compliance with state projects, right, through the logic of self-interest. But when liberal governance comes to the colonies, it was, as in the metropole, one directed towards enhancing what the state understood as the well-being of the ruled. And doing so required constructing the subject of rule, constructing his or her problems, which were constantly shifting, there were always new ones, and the various dimensions of these problems' resolutions. The crucial difference, of course, is that the colonial context, liberal governance is coupled with illiberal notions of the relationship between rulers and the ruled. This is to say that it does not depend upon any specification of the subjects of rule being active in their own government. Liberal government in the colonies was kind of a gift, as Achille Mbembe puts it, one that's given as a burden, one which is yet not a contract. So it's extended, and in the 30s we find that these non-normative subjects, right, women, convicts, the poor, and children, begin to gather state interests, right, precisely at this moment of the kind of extension of liberalism in the colonies, liberal governance. So filtered through the frameworks of imperial liberalism, the African child, or TAC, was ultimately articulated as a kind of a sign of vulnerability, of African pathology, and the paradoxical impossibility of African development. Between the 30s and 40s in my work, I see a kind of a collapsing of the distance between the young African, the African child, or the native child, and the child, period. Through a kind of a re-rendering of young African as a child, and of producing colonial children as liberal subjects. And the modern colonial child emerges as such as a sign of vulnerability, who confronts domestic threats from a newly reimagined Africa and its traditions. Through the work of emergent international humanitarian groups in particular, and later the colonial state, the appearance of the modern child in Africa serves to kind of require and legitimate interventions in African domestic worlds and potent new projects of subject formation within the empire, the colony, and the home. Through the child, imperial liberalism becomes imaginable as an enterprise of kind of proliferating vulnerabilities that reinstate the colony and the empire as the guarantors of rights, right, and humanity. So, the child can do profound work for colonial governance. And this is not only about the child, but the vulnerable subject in general, the convict, the prisoner, the slave, the woman, and so on, who gathers entitlement to protection by the state, entitlement to protection from her society, its traditions, its superstitions, and so on. So she's saved from endangering rituals and from a notion of the life course that is presumed to not accord any particularity, right, to the fact of youth. So thinking about these things, I was thinking about, the work that the girl widows do, right? For the cases against Sati, for the cases that introduce the phase of regulation or prohibition, and how the particularity of the girl or the girl widow becomes elaborated such that she can serve as a medium for the critique of custom and the validation of these salvationist kind of laws. My understanding is that after 1857 or so, there's a shift in imperial thinking such that individuation among the natives becomes seen as a threat, right? And the priority becomes placed on shoring up the power of traditions and customs, customary rulers, and so on. And this is the kind of idea of effective or efficient colonial rule that gets transferred over to Africa as indirect rule. So what does this kind of new anthropological turn that emerges after 1857 mean for girls, for women, for vulnerable subjects, right, formerly marginalized subjects who had enjoyed a kind of 15 minutes of utility for colonial governance, right? And I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Tanika, for allowing us to read your paper and respond to it. I feel like I'm the most outlier, I was telling Anu, since I neither work on in religious studies or in legal studies or in South Asian studies. And so Anu asked me to, just to think about some of my own work and how I'm looking at this work from the context that I'm more familiar with. One of the things I did appreciate your opening statements about and your differences with post-colonial theory, and I would largely agree with your interventions about disaggregating what have become monoliths in the conversation between the West and the East, etc. But one thing that you're very good at, you have, I think, given us a marvelous example of this disaggregation of the colonial rule and colonial administration. And I think following Winnie, that I think Winnie, you put the argument strongly that that this was a case, this was a moment in which you have an emergence of a different kind of self precisely through the whole negotiation and the messy history of regulating Sati. And so there is in the narrative that you give, which is one of the things that my class also read before this was the prehistory of rights, which is like the prehistory of rights, the prehistory of the emergence or the prehistory of a subject we now recognize as a rights-bearing. But one thing that I thought that you did well, but I would like to flip a little bit, was the way in which this disaggregation happens within the legal sphere as a result of regulation. So that what we're looking at here is that the disturbance, I think I'm trying to look for the disturbance, what you call the disturbance in the hegemonic authority, somehow is produced in the very spaces of production of hegemony, right? And what I wondered about was the other sources, other sites of origin for disturbance. Because I think that when I think about religion in the Philippine context, there's a great disparity, although overlapping, between the Catholic Church and the kind of hegemonic Christianity that is regulated by Scripture. And here it's very strong because you have a very strong scriptural tradition. And the way in which everyday practices of Christianity are much messier and have been given over to political movements that are quite radical. So in the context of the Philippines, much of the fight against the Spanish colonialism was against the clerical authority, right, of the church. So in many ways, the clerical authority, scriptural traditions were precisely the very thing that was being opposed by popular Christianity. And so it's no accident, I think, that what scholars have found in the political movements during the, both during the revolution against Spain and during the American colonial period afterwards, was that the whole narrative of Christ, the Passion, was completely imbued radical political movements, millenarian movements, etc., and that the interpretations of the life of Christ were precisely directing political movements against the state. So I guess what I'm trying to ask is that if there were other sources for the disturbance of hegemonic authorities that lay outside this legal field, what a broader context might be for thinking about the emergence of this new subject. Because it seems like within the confines of the legal field, I was dying to know what else was, not knowing this history, what was going on in a broader context that would make for the kinds of claims that would then be found to be expressing themselves through the legal frame, right? So I guess the reason I say it's a flip side is because as you're disaggregating colonial power, I thought perhaps a disaggregation of Hindu religion, Hindu practice was also necessary, because it seems to me that even though what I understand from your work here is that it's precisely this contestation that's going on between colonial administration and cultural nationalists that is shoring up a certain version of Hinduism, that I think that our attention cast onto this as Hinduism just leaves a whole other area of murkiness for me, as and perhaps you deal with it elsewhere. But here's, I'll give you another example that has come up as well for me. So, religious practice in political movements. Okay, so in the current moment, the way that religion has figured in state practices in the Philippines is the around the body of the violated domestic worker. The domestic worker who goes to all of these other countries, is abused, treated, possibly, killed, sent back to the country in boxes, in coffins, right? So, there's a discourse of the state that adheres to a certain kind of Christian sacrifice, in which, domestic workers have become heroized, become heroic because of their sacrifice for the nation. And we know the way that their bodies bolster a sense of the nation. And yet, in a particular case in the 90s, there was a domestic worker who was killed in Singapore. But interestingly, it was a very interesting case, which I actually written about as well. But I won't rehearse this here because she was killed by the state, but because she was implicated in the murder of her ward, right? So she becomes the victim of the Singaporean government. But again, on the side of the state, what happens is that her case becomes a way of bolstering, in the same way that that Abosede was talking about, of bolstering the state as the guarantor of the rights, as the one that's going to do the saving, as the one that's going to guarantee rights by creating more laws, by being by being the agent that would speak on the behalf of domestic workers, etc. But then popular movements around her death, and the practices of mourning, and the practices of reviving the narrative of the passion of Christ and the suffering, I think spill over beyond what can be managed by the sacrificial logic that the state wants to mobilize. And this has had many repercussions for radical movements, right, where the identification on the one hand with Christ, okay, so there's different gendered things going on here. On the one hand, there's an identification with the Christ figure, and which the state wants, it wants the domestic workers to be Christ-like, right? One of the things that I was reading in, one of the things that I write about were these poems by a feminist poet. in which rather than submitting to the narrative of being Christ-like, and rather than moving to a secular framework for, thinking about the rights of domestic workers, she invokes what I call an open political mythos, rather than that also invokes the suffering of Christ, but rather than thinking about the body of domestic workers as being the Christ body or Christ-like. What she invokes in her poetry is something like what I call Christ time, which is really the passage that doesn't depend on a gendered body, and it doesn't depend on a integral body. That the images that she gives us are very fragmented. They have to do with, ashes and fragmented body parts, and and permeable selves. And the reason that I mention this is because in everyday Christian practice, the notions of personhood and body also depart from, I think, maybe the notions of body in a more orthodox, Christian framework. And so what I'm pointing out is simply kind of the discrepancy in the arena of everyday life of many things such as gender and personhood, still Christian, I would claim, but not the Christianity of the state or the Catholic Church, that can be the source of the disturbance of hegemonic notions. And the last thing I will say is that the reaching for these narratives, these different social imaginaries, which can still be seen as, fully, religious, and the political claims that come out of it, also have to do with an interaction with material life, the way in which, and I know that you talk a little bit about this here, but as my asking you to give us a broader sense of what's going on for the condition of possibility for the emergence of this subject, that people's relations to their to everyday economic conditions also bear with it also hidden religious logics of its own. And I'm not going to expand on this, but there's been some work now, and quite a bit of work about the Christian premises of capitalism. And I'm not just talking about, the Protestant ethic. I'm not just talking about the Weber types of analysis of the religious dimensions of what would appear to be merely economic practice, capitalist practice. I'm also talking about the logics, for example, now, and I know my students read this for today's class, Melinda Cooper, on debt imperialism. The way, for example, a certain financial logic converges of speculative futurity converges with a neo-fundamentalist Christianity. The notions of temporality that are in finance capital converge with a certain idea of futurity that is completely compatible with Christian fundamentalism. Or, for example, I think Jane Goyer's work about thinking about the way that the philosophies, the religious philosophies of the fundamentalists also converge with the temporal philosophy of financial capital. So these are just things that I'm throwing out there. I know that they're beyond your work, but it makes me think that if we're going to get beyond, thinking of religion as in very specific sites, in this liberal conception, then we must also entertain the ideas that religion is also in just the very organization of economic life, that it's not legible for us as religion, but could very well be religious in its character, and that it would make sense that people's religious responses to the material conditions of their life is not simply an opposition, but is actually an articulation with and signification of what there is their just everyday economic life. So I'll just end there.
Thinking that maybe in the interest of time, Tanika, you could take a bit of time if you wanted to respond, but if you would like to have more engagement from the audience, which may also be nice, to have people who have been listening speak. So maybe we could, would you mind if we collect a few questions or comments, and then maybe you could integrate that into a kind of response?
Respond adequately to all these very rich questions.
How do we get to this notion of pain of a Sati who cannot speak, you know, the kind of discourse that kind of has been surrounding the idea of Sati and pain. And then my second question is almost in relation to the Joan of Arc bit that was brought up in Pampa Banerjee's work on burning women in general, and kind of in your work, how do you draw connections between gender and this very act of burning women and its legal connections across the board, and whether, you know, colonial British powers were cognizant or kind of reflective about the kind of witch burnings that were going back on at home versus how it was politicized and looked at within India in the form of the Sati.
While I was listening to the panel, I couldn't help but sort of get confused by the idea of reincarnation and sort of how do you connect the Hindu belief of reincarnation to the idea of consent, where as you separate the idea of religion from jurisprudence and law, for me, religion then exists within the individual, within the conscious, within sort of spirituality. Where does consent come in when life never ceases to exist?
You also brought in the question of Orientalism in your discussion, and you said when someone is critiquing a culture that has been viewed from an Orientalist lens, that brings up the problem of whether you're criticizing the whole culture or you're critiquing a certain part of it. So when we're discussing a culture that has been viewed through this Orientalist lens, through this paternalist kind of view that makes it seem lesser than it is and makes the whole culture seem like it's a problem, when do we criticize a certain aspect of that culture without making it seem as though we're condescending to that entire culture? Thank you.
Maybe these three are huge, large questions, and maybe take a moment and then come back and collect some more comments and questions.
Sure. Thank you all for very, very rich questions that I need to take back with me and think upon, and you know, maybe get back to you with considered response, which is not available to me right at this moment. For Winnifred, that was fascinating the way you ran them together, and I'll just sort of respond with a critical difference between the two, that the Sati is allowed only to script her death and not the life. Right. And the piety and power derives entirely from that. You know, the only history that she leaves behind, the only possible history that she can leave behind is the history of her death. And
but she can make the
moment
the contract
of death
to the affirmation of her desire to be a Sati can be made quite early in her life, though.
No, only at the moment of widowhood.
Only the moment of his death.
His death, and then immediately she has to burn.
Right.
So there is that time factor that doesn't allow too much of maneuvering. So yes, the moment of death can be scripted in very transgressive ways. She can sing, she can dance, she can publicly hug her husband, which she is not allowed to do in her lifetime. So as I say, that whether she's a good Sati, faithfully embracing death, or she's a bad Sati, escaping from the pyre, she is at odds with the normatively prescribed life. Right. So, you know, that moment is allowed to her. About the girl child and the girl and the little girl, and yes, in a sense that's a very valued point, that all the vulnerabilities under colonialism are concentrated and transposed to a figure to whom the state appears as a savior figure and not the source of vulnerability. Though in Age of Consent we find that the state refuses to take that role, where the state is hiking up the age of consent, and it would not name marital rape as rape, refuses to do so, refuses to blame culture, to stigmatize Hindu marriage as a whole. So that partly addresses the question of, I think you raised when to and how to stigmatize. And I'd sound very, you'd hate me for saying this, but my criticism of the colonial state is that it did too little and not too much of this criticism in this realm. Not elsewhere. Elsewhere, it was exploitative and, to the last possible, way. But here, it refused to condemn and castigate. Yes, we know that the savagery and the primitiveness of the Sati practices were invoked again and again, as was child marriage castigated. But if we look at what they were doing, it's another story. And there is a great deal of sensitivity shown to culture there, and a far less regard for the little girl who dies of rape or the little girl who's burnt as Sati. That was a very valuable question, Neferti, about disaggregating religion. And, in some other writings on Sati, I do that. And I look at the alternative scriptural sources that reformers cite. In fact, some of the state officials and missionaries also cite, and it was very interesting that in this whole process of debates, missionaries keep saying that this is not proper Hindu practice. So they are not saying that if you are a Hindu, you are condemned to die like this, and so you should not be a Hindu. They are in fact arguing from within Hinduism in a sense. So they are first reformers and then missionaries. So they are citing alternative traditions, and so do the reformers. They, in fact, didn't know all the scriptural sources. That was something that I was astonished to find out. There were stronger criticisms of Sati in some 9th century sources that obviously Ram Mohan Roy did not know about. And the scripture had not been consolidated before print culture came into being to the extent that they could use all the sources. So they always cite alternative scriptural sources. It does not, I think, ultimately add to a kind of sight of rights for the woman, because what the colonial state and reformism do together is to return her to her old, to sort of knit her back into culture, and would allow her entitlements in the name of culture alone, properly interpreted culture, authentic scripture. But to remain there is to say that if scripture does not allow you this, then you do not have access to that. So as a self, you have no rights. You have certain entitlements only as a culture-bearing person. But while it does that through its administrative procedures and what you talked about, the law as a site, the record keeping of the law, which sort of elaborates the process of consent or displays the process of consent, there are slits that appear in this kind of tight hegemonic control over her. And finally, the reformers themselves have to leave the region of scriptural reinterpretation and develop an ethnographic gaze focused on the woman's everyday material existence, and to re-describe her life as a life structured by pain and exploitation. So they go away from the realm of religion in order to reconfigure her as a different kind of subject structured by pain, and thereby mobilize moral opinion or a moral consensus for not burning her, for giving her education, for providing her with mobility and other things. I do discuss religion of a certain religious devotionalism or popular religious devotionalism as a site for an alternative self-making in the field of education, where the woman wants to know scripture, read scripture, and she claims a right to read scripture for herself and understand what God is for herself, but it does not happen in the realm of law. About the other questions, one was about when can we discuss or critically discuss a non-Western culture without being Orientalist. I think can we condemn a whole culture? No, we can't condemn a whole culture anywhere. In a sense, not even Western culture, if I may be permitted to say that, which we often do. As I said, we are too constrained by this fear of sounding like an Orientalist these days, and we have gone away from cultural criticism of our, in our own areas and regions and lives. And you can, of course, criticize aspects without condemning the entire thing out of hand. Why should you do that? And that's precisely what the reformers were doing, except that they kept on bringing back scripture. And the people who exited from that conundrum for the first time were Dalits. Okay? And they actually criticized culture, wholesale. But, there are ways of critically addressing aspects without condemning the whole. There's too much richness, even if of a problematic kind, within Hindu culture. As some missionary said, it's that cruel genius of Hindus. So there is great cruelty, there's great genius, both. Your question was?
About reincarnation. Consent and reincarnation when religion separated from jurisprudence and law.
Yes, I remember. In the sphere of personal laws, of course, religion is the foundation of jurisprudence. Their law and courts would not take a step without referring to scripture and without that being confirmed by pundits and religious ritual specialists. So there is no separation here. So, in the matter of rights, the community, the religious community, is the first receiver of rights. And then it becomes a problem that if the woman and the community are at odds, say the little girl is at odds, and there were cases of forced immolations, then how do you take back some of the rights given to the community and deposit it in the woman or in the girl? And that is one of the problems that is facing the colonial rulers in the late 18th, early 19th century, in the early 19th century. About reincarnation, the Sati actually escapes that for 3 million years, because for 3 million years she is assured of a place in heaven with her husband. So the question does not arise. But it's an interesting question in a way, because you would imagine that the Sati is a kind of a reincarnation of some divine force. And there should be a mythological annexure to the immolations, to the practice of immolations. But it's not that. We do not find, actually we find immolations, but they are not part of a ritual injunction in mythology. So the practice, the ritual is here, unlike most ritual cases, is detached from mythology. Okay? When the leader of the orthodoxy is asked, and there's a debate between him and Ram Mohan eventually his trump card is that what happens with immolations as they are practiced is not the scriptural form, but the customary form, because in the scriptural form, the sati walks into the fire, whereas here she's tied, repeatedly to the husband to the pyre, and then she's concealed by various obstructions, and then she's set on fire. So this is woman burning and murder, and not... So the orthodoxy then replies that since she's going to heaven, and she's not coming back to earth in a reincarnated form, it's very important to tie her up securely, because otherwise, in the process of burning, she might lose limbs and so on. And what's the point of going to heaven without these things? So.
Maybe, I think we're nearly at closure, but maybe if people have a few more questions, at least you could get a sense of people's thoughts and comments, and we can maybe bring things to a close. Yeah, please.
Hi, I was in reading the history of rights, I was really interested in sort of the alternative archive that you make, precisely around conflicting discourses around a possible rights-bearing subject, which this is the prehistory of rights. This is prior to rights being present. So I was wondering how you consider this legal studies project to, how do you sort of use this legal studies project? How do you think that you would sort of apply that, turning not the ethnographic gaze, but sort of an ethnographic ear to discourses that have already been articulated, or conflicts that have already been articulated?
Partially based also on a reading of your, is this on? Yeah. Okay, on a reading of your article on the prehistory of rights, and in that you deal with a slightly later period. But on the basis of what you say you are now working on, I suppose my question is that with the whole liberal discourse on rights and the creation eventually of a rights-bearing subject, which takes a long time, but what does this do to personhood and ideas of self in this transitional period that you are now interested in, and also in a nod to your contestation of the post-colonial perspective, what continuities do you see from the early modern period, in the sense of personhood or self in this transitional period, and also after the legislation that transformed gender in this, or whatever, attempted to legislate gender?
This particular, the abolition argument?
Yeah, so both in the transitional period and as a result of the legislation, what transitions do you see?
Not just the abolition in the colonial period, but Sundararajan was writing in the context of the Roop Kanwar case in the late 1989. So the post-colonial implications and a certain predisposition to colonial modes of legality, which sees legality as personhood in crisis. And so what are the implications now of, again, sort of the overreaching or the reticent state in terms of the guarantor of rights?
They're not saying, but I know that my class had a question that they articulated in class, which is really about what you see as the implications of this period and the debates that you, for thinking about, the debates now about women's rights as human rights, and if you had any thoughts, because this is the period in which they're thinking, and to try to translate this moment, because you're intervening in this moment, in this past moment now, to try to open that up, like what lessons might we take into the current moment in the debate about human rights.
Thanks. And again, I'm not sure that I can. The embarrassing thing is that I don't have a very clear memory of what I wrote in Prehistory of Rights. So I really cannot.
Says the historian.
So as I recall it, I had a rather optimistic view that bit by bit it is adding up to something like rights, and I still hold on to that, but I see many more complications in the whole process. And many more backtrackings. But what I wanted to emphasize there is the highly contingent and non-modular process of rights building. And liberalism there is something that eventually adds up to an approximation of the liberal notion of rights, but coming from very diverse and all, let's say, non-liberal sources or even anti-liberal sources. That part I still hold on to. But I find a greater problem in the way in which Brahmanical scripture remained the framework for deriving. And there the reformers had very little leeway because the state had structured legal change as something that could only be founded on scripture or customs. So they didn't have an option. And Ram Mohan does, at the end, exit from this, this framework briefly, but the major argument that he puts forward is still it's scripture, non-scriptural, it's customary. So I find a greater problem with that than I had earlier, because there's a limit to what you can endorse for a fully rights-bearing person within that framework. And how you can accept one half of scriptural readings and leave the other half out. And this is a question that became generational. So Ram Mohan, in his eagerness to abolish widow immolation, cites Manu, because Manu is silent. The next generation of reformers who want to legalize widow remarriage find that a great problem, because Manu has definitely said that no, to widow remarriage and prescribed perfect chastity. So Vidyasagar has to, almost invent an interpretation culled from another authority called Parashar, who he says is the greatest authority for modern age. And then the next generation of reformers are stymied by this, because Parashar had definitely recommended child marriage and cohabitation with child wives. So there is that limit, built-in limit. You accept that as the framework. There are points which you cannot cross. There are boundary lines which you cannot cross. What were the other questions? What can we take back for? That would bring me back to Hindu national, not back to, that's something that Anupama referred to, and the context that is created so profoundly by a resurgent Hindu nationalism. And we do say that it has got nothing, it's politicized Hinduism, it's a political formation, it's got nothing to do with religion. But for millions of people, it is religion. Ram's temple, Ram was born in this place, and his temple has to come up, demolishing a 16th century mosque. And since Muslims in the 16th century built that mosque, Muslims in the 21st century have to be massacred because they are bearing that guilt. So there is this a conviction in this recreated religion changes, and this has become the religious belief for a large number of Hindus, as Christian fundamentalism is, an article of genuine faith for large numbers of Christians. So that has a material basis also, in the new, in a sense, that kind of resurgent Hinduism is needed in order to demolish the post-independence structure of rights, collective and individual, and to, in a sense, implicitly justify the hierarchies that prevail within Hinduism without daring to address them or confront them outright, because that would really be a problem for vote gathering under conditions of universal suffrage. So this kind of, invocation of religion, and that became very obvious when, in the post-Delhi rape situation, religious leader after religious leader, and there, of course, Hindu fundamentalism met Muslim fundamentalism in a very cordial embrace for the first time. Westernization of women, that was a category that was used to not justify rape, but to explain rape and to order women to go back home. So that is the, that is the danger and the fear of secularism. Fear of secularism not as a disjuncture from religion, but fear of secularism as a political form that gives equal citizenship to all religions. And no matter what kind of a minority religious community might be, it has exactly the same rights within a secular state that the majority community has. So that might, and
I'm being given the signal that we would maybe want to bring the more official part of our meeting to a close, and you're all welcome to come and chat with Professor Sarkar and everybody else on the panel. But thank you all for staying, for coming, for your questions.
Thank you so much.
And thank you all.